that the Chinese leadership sees in its ability to continue 10% growth a year. In order to think about that question, we should think of how we should picture China if we were to draw an analogy. You could think of China as like a fast-moving car that's overtaking other countries. It's the country in the passing lane. China has overtook India in GDP per capita in 1979, overtook the Philippines in 1995, overtook Indonesia in 2001. So, and given the present trajectory, might even overtake Malaysia in the next 10 years. But one thing for sure, let's ask ourselves, what is likely to cause the car to crash? What are the bad things that could happen? To use the terminology of my generation, there can be 3 types of failure: hardware failure, software failure, and power supply failure. What's hardware failure? Hardware failure would be like what happened in the US in September 2008. The banking sector blows up. In other words, some economic mechanism malfunctions. For example, the government goes on a huge spending spree and printed money to finance the deficit. So that's what I mean by hardware failure. Software failure would be like a car crashing because people are fighting inside the car, and so the car swerves off the road. And if you look at China, what is its greatest policy objective? Its greatest policy objective is to build a harmonious society. That's the code word. And what is that a code word for? A fear of software failure. China really doesn't fear hardware failure. Why? Because how do you deal with a hardware failure like a banking crisis, a balance of payment crisis? You just look at what other countries have done and you just do the same. It's just like fixing a car, right? Just see what the mechanic does and you do the same. So hardware failure is something that the Chinese is very confident of that they can do. Software failure, they are fully aware of it being a source of difficulties, largely because the number of demonstrations in China have risen exponentially. The number of strikes, the number of worker actions is so high that the police have stopped reporting. So, but however, this is unlikely to lead to any bad outcome unless the parties speak over what to do. But corruption is certainly the weak point in the above said. It is delegitimizing the government. If you look at Transparency International, China ranks maybe 1 or 2 countries above the bottom. Here we have a country that's growing very fast, but at the same time exceedingly high rate of corruption. And this, the communist leadership sees as its biggest threat. In my opinion, the leadership in China has overlooked the 3rd kind of threat. Yes, overlooked the 3rd kind of threat because most countries do not face that threat. The 3rd kind of threat, besides hardware failure, software failure, is power supply failure. What is power supply failure? One example is environmental collapse. Northern China today is running out of water. So much water is being sucked up from the ground that north of the Yangtze, China is sinking 3 millimeters a year. But of course, that is, without water you cannot grow. And why is there a drought? And there's a drought largely because of global climate change. And this global climate change is partly caused by the large amount of CO2 that China is putting up into the air. So most countries in the past, when they dirty their own environment, they don't necessarily pay the consequences. A case in point would be Taiwan. Taiwan was possibly one of the dirtiest examples of industrialization. But the next time the typhoon blows, the dirty water is washed out to the sea, and the air is swept to somewhere else. But since Taiwan is a pretty small economy, it doesn't matter of how much dirty water and dirty air it produced. It didn't threaten the world. Whereas China is too big. It cannot repeat what Korea, Taiwan, and Japan does, because it's threatening the survival of the rest of the world. And the rest of the world will force China to do something. And how would one force China to do something? Protectionism. Because protectionism is already in the air. The protectionism, as seen in the disputes over the trade imbalance that China runs, weighs away the rest of the world. So given this atmosphere of protectionism, what's the implication for Malaysia? If the world were to lapse into protectionism, it will not be protectionism just against China, it will be protectionism against everybody. Especially since I told you that the rich economies are recovering slowly. And when they recover slowly, the domestic pressure for protectionism is exceedingly high. Look, the Doha rounds was announced in 2001, and 10 years later, it's still stuck. Why? Because the rich economies are being hollowed out by the rise of China and India. And you ask them to open their economies even more. Of course, they resist and not agree to it. And more than that, they might even reverse a lot of the gains of protectionism. So the first implication is that China's rise has created such a burst of export goods to the world that it is undermining the foundations of free trade unless the rich countries were to take the correct adjustment policies, which is that they have to upgrade their labor force and move most of the people up in making goods that are of higher value added. That is the only true solution. The alternative to that is to block the entry of foreign goods, which is a losing proposition for most people. So China's power supply failure comes from, one, the environment. Second, managing foreign economic relations. Specifically, it has to do something on the trade imbalances that is creating so much protectionist pressure. Think back of the November 2010 G20 meeting in Seoul. 3 weeks before the Seoul meeting in November 2008, what was the agenda that was shaping up? G20 in November 2010 was going to be a G2. It was going to be China against the rest of the world, because the United States had lined up all the others to pass a resolution against China for exchange rate manipulation. So all of that was set. And what saved China from being criticized in November 2010? The United States saved China, because 10 days before the G20 meeting, Bernanke announced quantitative easing 2, in which he flooded the US market with liquidity. And that drove the US dollar